So welcome everybody to the Sierra Club, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and Vermont Public Interest Research Group are happy to present a webinar today discussing Vermont's clean heat standard policy with two appointed members of the Vermont Climate Council, Richard Cowart from the Regulatory Assistance Project and Jared Duval of the Vermont Energy Action Network. So just to provide some background, as some of you might know, the Vermont Legislature passed the Affordable Heat Act last May, and right now the Public Utility Commission has started to develop our clean heat standard policy. So we're very excited today to have Richard and Jared explain a little bit about what the clean heat standard policy is and what it can do for us in Vermont. And then before I pass it over to Richard, I just wanted to highlight that we are recording this. And then also, if you have any questions as the presenters go through their presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will make sure to get to them as soon as we are done with our presentation from Richard and Jared. So with that, I will pass it over to Richard.
All right. Thank you very much, Erin. Richard Cowart. I'm with the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'm an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council. But it's important to note that I'm speaking for myself tonight, not really speaking for any of those organizations. Why are we here? Not long ago, the World Meteorological Organization warned that there's a 98% likelihood that one of the next 5 years and the next 5-year period will be the warmest ever recorded. Floods, droughts, monsoons, wildfires, there are so many climate emergencies that it hardly bears repeating them. And meanwhile, in the state of Vermont, we spend over $2 billion a year to import fossil fuels that we know that responsibly we actually shouldn't even be burning. For that reason, the Vermont Climate Council and the Vermont Legislature and many other individuals and organizations in Vermont have taken important steps to address the major sources of fossil emissions in our state. So what are we going to do in the next few minutes? The next slide, please. We're going to, Jared Duval and I will go pretty quickly through the Affordable Heat Act, tell you what it is, and give you a short introduction to where the PUC is in its process of implementing it. And then at the end of the presentation, you'll see there are additional resources. Next slide. Just to set the stage, among all of the challenges we face in developing climate policy, fossil heat is one of the toughest challenges. And in Vermont, it's the largest source of emissions from any sector. It was in 2020, and it's right up there with transportation going forward. 36% of our emissions today. Heating, space heating, also hot water heating, and some industrial processes. By the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements, large reductions are required. And I should note, these are based on well-recognized and internationally agreed upon scientific studies. 40% by 2030, 80% by 2050. These are impressive requirements, and we need to have policies to get us there. Lower income households have higher energy burdens. They live in less efficient housing, and they have more expensive heating sources. And our law, quite appropriately, and the Affordable Heat Act particularly, has a focus on ensuring equity in the way that we transition the heating sector. Our housing stock is one of the oldest in the country. The turnover rate is slow, so we can't wait on, it's not like the automobile fleet where we're going to get turnover in a decade and a half. We're talking 100 years to turn over a even a meaningful fraction of the housing stock. And then finally, heating is not something that can be addressed at the other end of the pipe, like putting a wind turbine at the other end of a power line. Changes have to happen in people's homes and in their businesses. So just imagine what is needed to make the thermal transition are hundreds of thousands of kitchen table decisions and investment decisions by individual homeowners. Next slide. Jared, I think it's you.
Sorry. Yep. So good evening, everybody. Really glad to be with you. Thanks for passing the baton, Rich. Just by way of introduction, my name is Jared Duval. I'm here in two roles, and I want to distinguish between them because they require different things of me. My day job is as Executive Director of the Energy Action Network. Many of you are familiar with EAN for the tracking, research, and analysis that we provide, including via our recently released annual progress report for Vermont. This chart that you see on the screen right now is from that report. And we do that work to help ensure that Vermont's energy and climate conversations are grounded in the latest and highest quality available data, and that we are having fact and evidence-based conversations about Vermont's energy transition and climate responsibility. At the same time, I also serve with Rich as an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council. And in that role, we are required by the legislature and by the Global Warming Solutions Act to make policy recommendations that can meet our obligations that outlined in the Solutions Act. And so while in my EAN role, I do not take positions on any bills before the legislature or proceedings before the Public Utility Commission. We are a neutral convener of a broad and diverse network of members that have many different opinions about different policy issues. And we do not do any lobbying before the legislature or the PUC. In my appointed council role, was required to identify the policy options and recommendations that could meet the legal obligations that Vermont has set for itself through the Global Warming Solutions Act. So that's just some background. And what I want to start with here on this slide is that it is not just about our legal obligation and moral responsibility to reduce climate pollution in line with international scientific targets for Vermont to do our part. It is also about helping Vermonters get off of the fossil roller coaster. You can see here in the gray, in the pink, and in the purple lines how, on average, fossil heating, especially fuel oil, propane, and kerosene, are incredibly high cost and price volatile ways to heat homes. And so one of the things that this act is designed to do is help people transition, help more Vermonters transition to lower cost and more price stable heating options, including via heat pump water heaters, advanced wood heating systems, weatherization, which can reduce heating use regardless of what your heating source is. But this really was designed as a policy to do multiple things at once, reducing emissions while reducing energy costs and helping folks get off of this fossil fuel price roller coaster. We also recognize that Vermont is starting from a different place than much of the rest of the country. We are much more reliant on what are often called delivered fuels, fuel oil and propane in particular. You look at the rest of the country, and it's about 58% of the heating in the United States comes from fossil fuel sources, and about 49% is from fossil gas, also sometimes known as natural gas or pipeline gas. In Vermont, we both have a much higher dependence on fossil fuels for heating. 72% of our heating comes from fossil fuels, and our fossil gas use is much lower than much of the rest of the country. And the fossil fuels that we are using primarily are very high carbon intensity fuels that create a lot of climate pollution, especially fuel oil and propane. And you can see this is just a graph that shows the different carbon intensities of different fossil fuels. All of them are very high, over 100 pounds of carbon dioxide per MMBTU. And I think that, the two main takeaways of this graph are how carbon intensive the fossil fuels are and how low carbon Vermont's electricity portfolio is in contrast. And so that will have to be a big part of the transition, is getting more of our energy met through our low carbon electricity sector as opposed to our fossil fuels. So I'm going to do a couple of more slides here just to introduce the basic concept of a clean heat standard. It is what's known as a performance standard, and it's setting a performance standard on importers of fossil heating fuels into Vermont. And it requires them to deliver or cause to be delivered emissions reducing activities. That can either be through weatherization, it can be through heat pump installations, heat pump water heaters. There's a whole range of things that can help reduce emissions in the heating fuel sector that are eligible. But the basic responsibility and requirement, the obligation, is on the importers of fossil heating fuels. Those are the folks who ultimately have to be responsible for ensuring, either directly or indirectly, that cleaner heat solutions are made available to Vermonters, and especially lower and middle income Vermonters, and that they have the resources they need to make those transitions equitably. We'll get more into how that's addressed in the legislation that was passed. But before we go there, I do want to say that this idea of a performance standard is very well established in the energy policy space. We have...
I want to hit the next slide.
Thanks, Rich. Over 30 states have renewable portfolio standards, which are performance standards on the electricity sector. 25 states have energy efficiency performance standards. There are low carbon fuel standards for importers of transportation fossil fuels in California, Washington, and Oregon. And those were key blueprints that were used in the design of the clean heat standard that was developed and recommended by the Vermont Climate Council and then established into law by the legislature. It's also worth noting, and Rich can say more about this, that while Vermont is one of the first two states, along with Colorado, to pass a clean heat standard, there are another 9 states that just announced in the last month that they're exploring or moving forward efforts to establish their own clean heat standards as well. And that was announced through the U.S. Climate Alliance, the group of governors that has committed to doing their state's part towards the national commitment that the United States made as part of the Paris Agreement. Is this you, Rich, or do you want me to take this?
I think it's yours.
Okay, sorry. So this is the direct language from the Climate Action Plan that was adopted by the Vermont Climate Council in December of 2021. And, there was a lot of thought given to other policy options. Some folks would say, why not a carbon tax instead of a performance standard? And there are many reasons for that in our deliberations, why we did not opt to recommend that. But I think one of the biggest is that the goal that the Climate Council was charged with by the legislature is to reduce climate pollution and create savings for Vermonters, not to raise money or to increase costs. And a clean heat standard is a much more effective policy mechanism at giving certainty around reducing pollution and being able to equitably create economic savings than a kind of roughly designed carbon tax. Of course, there are different policy designs that could happen, but that was a key decision early on, and that was a decision that was shared both by the Climate Council and by the Vermont Legislature, of preferring a performance standard to a carbon tax approach.
Thanks, Jared. We aren't going to be able in this short session to take you through all of the architectural decisions made in the design of a clean heat standard, but as with any performance standard, it's useful, to remind ourselves of the essential elements. What is the obligation? Who are the obligated parties? How fast are we going? How to promote equity? What actions actually satisfy the obligation? And in this case, we say earn credits. Individual choices about solutions that we may want to promote or may want to discourage or exclude. And then, of course, there's the administrative questions. Who's responsible in the government for making it happen? So quickly touching on some of those high points. The nature of the obligation here is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act. We could design performance standards for a variety of things or to address a variety of targets. But in this case, we're trying to keep our eye on the prize here, and the main goal is to reduce emissions in the sector. And as Jared pointed out, we exist in what I consider the happy reality that, for the most part, reducing emissions in the thermal sector will also, in the long term, reduce thermal bills. Who are the obligated parties? All fossil heat importers. There was a discussion early on about whether this should just be the regulated utility, Vermont Gas, or whether the delivered fuel importers should be obligated as well. As Jared pointed out, something close to 75% of our thermal sector is imported delivered fuels. And it didn't make any sense to try to meet our climate goals only by regulating the pipeline gas company. Then how can those obligated parties meet their obligation? Here's a really important focus here. The additional focus of this legislation was to reduce thermal load and heating bills for Vermonters in Vermont. That is, we really are focused on improving the building stock, improving the way we heat the building stock in Vermont. It's not some kind of global carbon trading program that would meet the obligation by investing in offsets somewhere else.
And I'll just note, Rich, that it is in fact explicitly prohibited, as you know, in the legislation the offsets are not allowed to qualify. The reductions have to happen in Vermont. I think that was an important piece that sometimes got missed in the conversation in the first couple of years.
Yeah, and this has been an important thing, I think, for many legislators, certainly for us, that our goal is to deliver these changes in a very tangible way in Vermont buildings. Next slide. What actions earn credits? Jared already mentioned this. There are some public policies, and particularly in other states, where the focus is on just one thing, say a technological standard for water heaters, or a requirement for certain kinds of furnaces, or just a weatherization program. But there are a lot of ways to reduce the emissions in the building sector. And one of the goals of this legislation as a performance standard, as opposed to a technological standard, is to open the door to a lot of creative solutions, combinations of things, different choices. One of the reasons we feel strongly about, and I believe the legislature felt strongly about, choice, is that customers matter. I mean, customers are making the decisions here about what are they going to do in their home or in their business? And we wanted to make sure, as a performance standard, to allow customer choice to basically drive the transition. Additionally, some people said, well, if should we only give credits to those actions taken by obligated parties and the importers? And we thought about that for quite a while, but the answer, frankly, is, well, why should we do that? The goal is to reduce carbon emissions. So if a weatherization program, for example, can reduce emissions, or Efficiency Vermont can reduce emissions, or a heating and ventilating contractor can install heat pumps on their own, why shouldn't they be able to be credited for those actions? More people in the field means more creativity, more competition, more choice. We get the job done faster. Next slide. This is just an illustrative slide, but it's one of many pathways that we could look at in order to, answer the question, well, how many of these switches do we really need in order to meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act? And so I emphasize this is just one combination among many that illustrate the answer to that. And the most important point is here on this slide is the fact that there's at least 4 different solution sets mentioned on this slide. So you've got weatherization, a combination of weatherization jobs, hot water heat pumps, air or water source heat pumps for space heating, and pellet stoves as some combination to deliver the emission reductions that are required by the GWSA. There are a number of other resources not listed here: geothermal district heat, solar thermal, some alternative gases aren't on this chart. But some combination is how it's going to play. If you allow obligated parties to choose their pathways and you allow Vermonters to choose what they want to use for heat, we're going to have a variety of sources to meet the standard. Next slide. Jared?
So it was very clear in the Global Warming Solutions Act, a commitment of the Vermont Climate Council, and very clearly a commitment of the state legislature, that the energy transition has to be a just transition, and that the goal is not just to reduce emissions, but to build a more equitable energy economy that lowers, durably lowers energy burdens and energy costs for folks. So one of the primary way that Act 18, the Affordable Heat Act, aims to enshrine this and really center this in the heart of the law is by requiring a certain amount of clean heat benefits, clean heat credits, to come from serving low and moderate income households. 16% of all of the clean heat activity has to come from services delivered to low income Vermont households, whether that's weatherization, heat pump installations, many of the measures that we have talked about. And another 16% needs to come from serving low or moderate income households. So that's 32% of the total. Now that may seem low, but remember the thermal sector, all of our heating sector, the residential portion is just a slice, and that there's also a commercial and industrial sector that will have to achieve emissions. So 16% of total emissions reductions across the thermal sector from low-income households, and 16% from serving low or moderate income households. if the reductions happen in proportion to kind of where the fuel use happens across the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, what that would, and we have a slide on this later that I can show, what that would translate to is 60% of all of the residential activity in the clean heat standard, 60% of all the emissions reduction activities happening in homes would come from serving low and moderate income households, which would be a progressive share, meaning that low and moderate income households would be served at a level greater than their share of the population, because we recognize that the energy burdens for those households in Vermont are much higher, the share of income spent on heat, and the benefits in terms of health, in terms of dollar savings and comfort, can be much greater for folks who are living in less efficient, more drafty heating stack with older and less efficient heating systems. In addition, there is a provision in the law that says 50%, half of all of those clean heat services that have to be delivered to low and moderate income households have to be long-lived measures that will durably reduce energy costs over time. So that is investments like weatherization that will lower fuel bills for over 2 decades, heat pumps, which have an average lifespan of about 15 years, advanced wood heating systems, 20 to 25 years. So those are a few of the really key provisions in terms of centering energy equity in this policy. This is just a summary of some of the rationale behind the clean heat standard. The timing of this is important in terms of, this was being debated last year when fuel oil and propane and kerosene prices had spiked, and it was really clear that it's time to get off of the fossil fuel roller coaster. We know that because of advances in technologies and because of incentives that are made available through our distribution utilities, our electric utilities, our efficiency utilities like Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric and VGS, and the federal incentives made available by the federal government, that it is already the case that many of the clean heat options cost less, sometimes upfront, and many times over the life of the system than do the often higher cost and more price volatile fossil fuel alternatives. There was a recognition that doing this activity at a time when the Inflation Reduction Act is rolling out will help Vermont capture many more of those dollars. And there was a lot of study that went into the potential savings over the lifetime of the actions for Vermonters. We will get into some of the further study and process that is involved with the Public Utility Commission and the Public Service Department. And we also know, I should briefly mention number 6, that markets are dynamic and costs are not fixed. And we know that when economies of scale are achieved, when technologies advance, it is possible that we see very rapid rather than just kind of linear change in terms of being able to scale up new and cleaner and more efficient markets. So this is really key. When Rich and I are talking about some of the things that are eligible for the clean heat standard, everything, there is no one category that is always yes or always no. Well, what it all has to come back to is transparent, rigorous analysis showing that there are actual life cycle emissions reductions achieved based on that fuel pathway. So many folks may have followed the debate about the inclusion or not of certain biofuels. The short answer is it depends on the biofuel, its source, its production method. Does it result in indirect or direct land use change? Whether or not a biofuel is eligible to earn clean heat credits will depend on the fuel pathway life cycle analysis And this is very much in line with the best practices of the states that have established performance standards out west. This is what we see Oregon and Washington and California doing as well. And I think that we've covered most of the other points on this slide, except to just underline what Rich said, which is this is not replacing other thermal programs. It is building on other existing programs that already exists and seeks to provide even further support and an additional revenue stream to expand weatherization, especially weatherization for lower income households through the Weatherization Assistance Program, the programs through Efficiency Vermont, the energy transformation projects that the electric utilities are doing through Tier 3 of the Renewable Energy Standard, and on and on.
Okay. I can do this one, Jared, because you already did half of it. The question of biofuels in the context of any form of thermal transition, is a thorny one. And as Jared just pointed out, the answer chosen by the legislature in this legislation is to basically determine the eligibility for biofuels to be creditable as an improvement over fossil fuels is a scientific one, rooted in the total life cycle impacts of any alternative fuel. And this includes liquid biofuels, renewable natural gas, or woody biomass. And so the answer at this moment is that if you were to ask us, is a certain kind of fuel going to be creditable under the clean heat standard, we would have to say it depends on the scientific analysis as determined by through a process that's included in the legislation to create a technical advisory group that would advise the PUC on those matters. This is very similar to the way a technical advisory group advises the PUC today on how to count the benefits of different kinds of energy efficiency measures. Then the legislation also includes an additional requirement to just put a safety belt on top of an airbag, I guess you'd say, or an airbag on top of a safety belt, which is to require an increasing degree of stringency in terms of the benefits delivered, the carbon benefits delivered by any biofuel or alternative fuel that's going to be used within the clean heat standard. And that is an increasing level of stringency over time for the degree to which it has to be better than the fossil fuel that it replaces. Specific attention was paid in the legislation to so-called renewable natural gas or alternative gases that could be delivered through the pipeline system to Vermont. And the legislation contains protections, including that they can count for credits under the clean heat standard only if they're actually reducing waste gases that would have been released to the atmosphere, and therefore they're providing an environmental benefit from the get-go. Vermont Gas has to own the gas and its attributes so that there can't be any double dipping. And they have to also have a contractual pathway to deliver that gas to the Vermont gas system. And again, as with all of these fuel pathways, it's only on a net life cycle GHG basis. So there are very substantial protections with respect to biofuels written into this legislation, but biofuels are accepted as a possible part of the pathway mixes that we may see particularly during the transition period. Next slide. How would the Affordable Heat Act be implemented? In different states, different states that are considering clean heat standards have chosen different administrative pathways. Massachusetts and Maryland, for example, are highly likely to keep it within the environmental agency. Colorado has assigned this responsibility to the Public Utility Commission. Vermont's legislation assigns it to the Public Utility Commission. The legislation also includes a provision which is not yet included in other states, but which I think would work very well elsewhere, and particularly would work well in Vermont. And that is to establish something called the default delivery agent. Imagine a fuel dealer who qualifies as an importer, if they do qualify as an importer, and are therefore an obligated party, but they really don't want to get into the clean heat business. They just want to do what they have historically done, which is delivering commodity fuels. They can choose to delegate their responsibility under the Act to a default delivery agent appointed by the PUC. And this is quite similar to how Efficiency Vermont works today. It's delivering energy efficiency services on behalf of a number of utilities who would be obligated to do this under Vermont law, but instead have chosen to let Efficiency Vermont deliver for them. As I mentioned earlier, the legislation creates a technical advisory group called the TAG, which would advise on credit values and life cycle rates. This is similar to the tags we have in place today for renewables and for energy efficiency. The legislation also creates an equity advisory group to help ensure that the affordability and fairness goals that Jared talked about are respected throughout the entire process of establishing and implementing the clean heat standard. Can we go to the next slide? I guess this is a bit of a reprise of some points that Jared made earlier, but I've often been asked, why do we need to do this? Why can't we just let the market continue to slowly, gradually improve the emissions profile and the efficiency of heating systems? And the answer is current progress is way, way too slow. We need a policy driver to get off the fossil roller coaster and save billions of dollars in fossil heating bills, and to deliver large savings in climate pollution. Our experience has been, and this is the experience of jurisdictions across the country and around the world, that the level of incentives that we could expect to provide just by themselves are not fast enough. And public revenues and annual appropriations aren't reliable enough. Businesses need a predictable path. If you're an HVAC company and you're thinking, am I going to get in the heat pump business? Am I going to train my employees to be good at designing and installing heat pumps? It's important to know that there's going to be a future, predictable path of business development for that business. And the same thing is true for commercial real estate owners. They need to know that this law is going to take effect and it's going to create opportunities, and they can be on the lookout for how to take advantage of the provisions of this law. It's one more time making the point that we recognized from the very beginning of talking about any form of clean heat, whatever the policy is, that equity has to be a key component of the transition. Diversity is also important. Customers, Vermonters will demand the opportunity to choose the heating system that they will install in order to improve their emissions and lower their bills over time. And as Jared pointed out earlier, performance standards have shown that they work extremely well in the renewable arena and in the energy efficiency arena. And we think they can work here too. I think the next slides are simply to take you very briefly through a preview of coming attractions mostly. The legislation sets out a schedule that it begins with this date, June 30, 2023, and it ends in January 2025 when the PUC is required to deliver the proposed rules to implement the clean heat standard and a potential study that explains its costs and benefits to the legislature. Proposals have you just skipping through these slides, you can see there's there are two dockets open now. The first is to establish to begin the rulemaking, and I think that docket will continue over the next more than a year in order to develop the rule. So that's case number 23-2220. The second docket, 2221, is an investigation into the budget and plans for the default delivery agent. Next slide. So the PUC is hiring people to implement this law. That's the June date here. The PUC has solicited applications for individuals and nominations to serve on the TAG and the Equity Advisory Group. The PUC has not yet named or appointed the people to those groups, but those applications are in. Next slide. There will be an extensive public engagement process as this rule is developed, and the PUC has issued an RFP to hire a facilitator. And to clean heat measure characterization, technical consultant sounds very complex name, but basically you've heard us say about 10 times now that life cycle analysis, GHG emission analysis is critical to the implementation of this bill. And those technical matters will be presented to the PUC, and they're interested to have a technical consultant to help them analyze that information. Obligated parties will need to register with the PUC by January 2024. There's a check back report due to the legislature in February, and you can see the other deadlines on this slide and go into the last one. Final proposed rules submitted to the legislature by the PUC after public comment and after an extensive process of public participation, frankly, over the entire process, at which point the legislature will have the opportunity to review it and to vote again on whether the clean heat standard will go into effect. I think that's it. A number of additional resources are available to you. in terms of engaging with in the PUC process, the ePUC, the electronic webpage of the PUC is a great place to enter the process and follow all of the filings and hearings that the PUC is going to be holding.
Great. Thank you both for those excellent presentations and a background on the Clean Heat Standard and the Affordable Heat Act. A couple questions did come into the chat that I'll get to, but I wanted to just reiterate that if anyone does have any questions, to please feel free to ask them. Jared, was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I'm good.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry. Great. So first is there were quite a few questions about the measures that can be offered. And so I guess you both did kind of cover that there's going to be a lot of input on these measures, but kind of one question came through that maybe we'll start with, which is the involvement of the utility companies in this question asker writing the science as they have in the past, such as in Burlington's biomass plant. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the utilities will be involved, maybe how interested stakeholders could be part of the process also, because I think you both emphasized public input. But yeah, we'll start with that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to initially respond to that. So that the measures will be assessed in a transparent, rigorous way by the technical advisory group, which has 15 appointments. The legislation recognized that it's important to have a diversity of information so that things aren't getting missed. And so there is at least one and perhaps two of those 15 seats that will come from the regulated utility space. But many others will be from other entities and independent perspectives. But at the end of the day, everything is going to have to go back to peer-reviewed science. It mentions the IPCC process, the federal models that have been developed by Argonne National Labs, and the GREET model. So everything is going to have to be transparent and peer-reviewed and based on a strong scientific basis. Now, it is a fair point, or I should say, it is very important to say that the science is not always settled, and that there are improving models and methodologies for doing very complex life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting. And so there will be important choices to be made, and it will be really important to follow the emerging science. So we're using the latest and best available information as a state.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And Richard, I was wondering if I could pass it to you to talk a little bit about if other states have put limitations on measures as part of their clean heat standard, or if you've seen other states tackle the issue of what measures are available differently.
The only other state that has adopted legislation to this point is Colorado. And Colorado has put a percentage limitation on the obligated pipeline gas companies, that only a certain fraction of their emission reductions can come from what they term a recovered methane. That's just one example. I know that in other states that are considering clean heat standards, including Maryland and Massachusetts, that this is a open topic of conversation, whether and how to limit various alternatives that might be, suggested as alternatives to fossil gas. And in some instances, they're just excluded. For example, the Vermont legislation excludes all forms of hydrogen except demonstrated green hydrogen. That's it. It's hydrogen coming from renewable electricity is permitted. And I would expect that, similar sort of blanket prohibitions will be considered in other states. But on the other hand, if you're considering a clean heat standard generally, some degree of flexibility is going to get built into that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, great examples. And as you heard, the policy is being written as we are writing it. So we've pulled from some examples from some states, but also opportunities maybe to be sure that when we enact it in Vermont, it falls in line with everything that we want to see. So we had another question that's more kind of policy based. So in addition to a performance standard or possible carbon tax, are there any conversations about incentivizing overall consumption reduction or any other policies under consideration? I guess both of you can put on your climate council hats. Maybe I'll pass it to Jared to start us off with.
Yeah, I mean, Rich and I both serve on what is called the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee. Rich actually co-chairs it. And that's the primary subcommittee that was charged with the responsibility of identifying the policy options for reducing climate pollution, for meeting our emissions reduction obligations. We wanted to keep an open mind and not immediately jump to any one recommendation and really kind of think through and hear out the different options. I think a number of us from the start, I will just speak for myself, were skeptical of the idea of a carbon tax, but it was out there and was worth looking into. And I think that as we dug deeper and looked at that, it became very clear that by traditional design, that would not be an effective solution if what we are trying to do as a state and as directed to us by the legislature is to ensure that we are reducing energy costs while giving a degree of certainty around emissions reduction in line with our legal obligations and the scientific targets. Carbon taxes are generally good at raising revenue. As traditionally designed, they are not good at providing certainty around emissions reduction. And unless there is a lot of redistribution built in on the back end, they can be fairly inequitable. And so it felt, in terms of being able to assure that we met the legal obligation and centered equity much more strongly and front and center, the performance standard option rose to the top. I will say there are other options that I think are similar and that could have some of those same benefits. We discussed a cap and invest program, and that was the recommendation that the Climate Council made to address the transportation sector climate pollution, was for Vermont to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative, a proposed region-wide cap and invest program to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. That kind of agreement fell apart as multiple states pulled out in literally the weeks before our plan was adopted. And so we were in this spot where we thought that we had addressed policy recommendations economy-wide for multiple sectors, and then we were left with this major gap in the transportation sector. And the council has said in an addendum to the climate action plan that the only known ways to achieve the reductions legally obligated by the Solutions Act in line with the science are one or both of a cap and invest program or an emissions cap program generally, and or a performance standard for the transportation sector, like has been developed for the heating sector. So I think that those are really the two ones that have emerged based on the criteria there. But again, there's no silver bullet on this. And a lot of these policies are not mutually exclusive. They can be complementary, including, performance standards on equipment and incentives and different types of regulation on large emitters. There's a whole range of things. But in terms of a central primary policy driver, performance standards and cap and invest programs are really the only ones that we have found that can, with confidence, deliver the scale and pace of emissions reductions we need and want, while doing so equitably and reducing energy costs for the long term.
It's hard to add much to what Jared just said, but I will make one additional point, which we touched on earlier, and that is about incentives. One of the principal goals, and it's baked into the DNA of the Clean Heat Standard, is to incentivize emission reduction wherever it can come from. So, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act offers substantial financial benefits to Vermonters, including Vermont businesses. They might choose to take actions to improve building performance or to change the heating systems in those buildings. So there's a huge incentive sitting on the table. And one of our goals in the coming years should be figure out the policy system in the state of Vermont that will maximize the degree to which we can capture those federal incentives for the benefit of Vermonters. And the Clean Heat Standard is designed to do that. We also want to incentivize the existing companies that have been delivering commodity fossil fuels, incentivize them to work with their customers to basically change their business model to becoming the providers of clean heat services. And there's a robust business future there for the folks who might want to do that. And the same thing is true towards incentivizing HVAC contractors, people who aren't currently delivering fossil fuels, but they do deliver heating services, to deliver low emission heating services to their customers in the future. So creating incentives is a huge part of what a performance standard is designed to do.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I'll also highlight Vermont has, I know of 2 businesses in Vermont that have gone from delivering fossil fuels to delivering efficient electric, one of them being Vermont Gas, that now installs electric water heaters. And so this is a pathway that we can see for these kinds of measures. So we are about 1 minute from 8 o'clock. I'm going to do one more question pertaining to the impact of low-income customers for our presenters, but I wanted to clear up 2 things quickly because there's been some discussion in the chat. First, about Hydro-Quebec. So I wanted to emphasize that the Clean Heat Standard is focusing on end uses and reducing the energy used at the end uses, not necessarily generation. So that's why we're focusing mainly on the Clean Heat Standard. And then also to the many attendees who asked about what measures will be included in the Clean Heat Standard, I just want to advertise to you or reiterate to you that there is a robust public process going on right now to figure out what measures should or should not be included, and they have to listen to the public. So if you want to make sure your voice is heard, please submit public comments to the docket, consider going to the meetings, and being sure to voice any concerns that you have there, because it's a rare opportunity to have that kind of access. And with that, I'll finish with one attendee asked about the impacts to low-income customers in the Vermont gas system area. And I was wondering if there has been any discussion around that with the Clean Heat Standard.
Yeah, I think the question I saw was, I think it was from Liz, and about what options would be available for a lower income customer in VGS territory. And I think there are a number. I mean, one, first and foremost, would be incentivized weatherization. I mean, VGS has publicly stated that one of the ways that they are planning to comply with the Clean Heat Standard is to expand the offerings and the incentives that they already have for weatherization, which paired with other programs can, be free or heavily reduced depending on income. There's also opportunities to replace water heaters that are currently using fossil gas with heat pump water heaters. I think that the kind of financial savings of heat pumps versus fuel oil and propane are much stronger. So most of the rest of Vermont is really well positioned to be able to see massive cost reductions by reducing dependence on fuel oil and propane via heat pumps. Fossil gas is a lower cost fossil fuel, and the customer economics comparing heat pumps versus fossil gas are more difficult. So there may be more limited kind of win-win options there, but there are still a number of options, including weatherization and more efficient water heating. Rich may want to say more about that.
No, I liked your answer. I guess I would also point out that no customer is required under this legislation to make any particular change. So it's the obligation rests with the importers of fossil fuels to put packages, solutions in front of customers who choose to adopt them. And also Vermont Gas, to the degree that it is an obligated party, doesn't necessarily have to deliver all of those solutions to folks on their pipeline system. They can help Vermonters anywhere to reduce their fossil burdens. And those two, big elements of flexibility, remind us that one of the advantages of a performance standard is choice.
Great. Excellent. Thank you both. Jared and Richard, again, thank you both for your presentations. I'll open it up to see if there's any last minute thoughts you'd like to leave the group with before we wrap for the night.
I just want to give my thanks to you for hosting and to everybody for turning out, and to say that the more I participate in these conversations, the more I'm reminded how important it is to approach energy issues with humility and open-mindedness. A lot of this there's a lot we're building on in terms of the example of performance standards elsewhere, but there's also part of this that is happening in a new way. And I appreciated the comment in the chat from Phil, who said, the GREET model that assesses life cycle emissions, that was developed for transportation fuels. And that's absolutely true. That's what the Argonne National Labs developed that for. That's how California, Oregon, and Washington have used it. And there will need to be new studies and peer-reviewed analysis to characterize the life cycle emissions of things that are only on the thermal side that aren't on the transportation side, like wood. And that's an open question. And so I really appreciated your invitation, Aaron, for folks to follow that and provide comment. But I appreciate doing this work with and alongside all of you, because I think that open-mindedness, that transparency, that civility of we can do this. We need to do so carefully, but with real commitment. It's an important and inspiring thing.
Thank you, Richard. Anything to add?
Jared mentioned commitment and humility and open-mindedness as we go forward. I mean, recognizing that we are in the lead here in Vermont, developing the best pathway to transition away from fossil fuels in a really, in a sector that's resisted change. And I feel, fortunate in the fact that it's Vermont that's doing this. My experience in the Vermont Legislature has been that, compared to other places where I've worked, and I've worked in a lot of other jurisdictions, the thoughtfulness and dedication of the legislature in developing this legislation was outstanding. And if we are able to continue that degree of thoughtful engagement as we develop the rules through this process, we will provide an example to many other jurisdictions. And so it's an important work that we're doing here. It extends far beyond Vermont.
Excellent. Thank you both for those amazing words at the end. And with that, I'll pass it to Rob to close us out.
Yes, thank you all for participation in this event. Jared and Richard, thank you. I've learned actually a lot because I primarily, with my campaign work with the Sierra Club, has been working on clean transportation methods. So your expertise on this is very much appreciated. But I just wanted to throw in a couple things of upcoming events. Actually, we had tonight is with our clean heat standard, so I should have cut that out. But there's a whole line of other meetings that we have going on, and I just threw it on the Sierra Club website, and actually has this information. But there's a bunch of other. Jared's going to be participating with another webinar with Vermont Natural Resources Council about their progress, Vermont's climate progress. We're also going to be showing a film called "The Quietest Year," which is produced by an activist in Stowe about noise pollution, which will primarily cover a lot of things about diesel trucks and the F-35s. But then I also wanted to flag in here because there's a bunch of conversations that people posted in the chat about Hydro-Quebec. And we rely on a lot of power from Hydro-Quebec, and that's part of our renewable energy standard. There's two simultaneous processes that are going through right now with the legislature trying to create a reform process that includes the utilities and the environmental community, trying to hash out differences, but then the Department of Public Services is looking at things a little bit further. So Vermont Natural Resources is hosting that webinar as well. And then our other sponsor, the Make Big Oil Pay conversation, that's part of VPIRG's big campaign, and on the 18th, and then there's a climate resiliency conversation, which I want to flag. Is we got to make sure is we need to have resiliency within our communities, but we also need to reduce our carbon emissions while we at it. And the term I like to use is you can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we're going to have to do both, making sure our communities are resilient while we reduce our carbon emissions. And then also, so thanks to the VNRC co-sponsoring this event with us, but also thanks to VPIRG as well for their sponsorship. And I just want to flag that they asked me to share this information about the Make Big Oil Pay Tour. And if you see there's the upcoming dates that they have events. They have one tonight, and then tomorrow in St. Jay and Brattleboro. So you can attend those events. But again, thanks. And actually those links are up here. So anybody want to try to get those links all right there. But thank you all for the conversation. Thanks, Aaron and Luke from the Sierra Club Executive Committee, and Suzanne, who's on here too. She asked a question in the chat. So I appreciate it. Thanks, Al.